So I'm going to show you a quick demo using Azure functions. Now everyone's probably heard of serverless computing by now. If not, I encourage you to have a look at the documentation on Azure functions. You can get up and running pretty quickly, and I'm going to show you how to do that. And it's free to get going, so feel free to sign up and have a play. What I'm going to do is show you how to quickly create a RESTful API using Azure functions, linking to DB, which is Azure's document database. So what we need to start with is some data. So I'm going to use GitHub and some gists that GitHub exposes, and this is just some JSON data here, and there's 30 records, but the content isn't really of any interest to us, just that we've got some data to work with. So first of all, log into the Azure portal. I'm going to create a new DB. And I need to give it an ID, so I'm going to call this functions API demo. Needs to be lowercase. Functions API demo, and that is available. Now we need to choose how we want to interact with the DB. I'm going to choose the SQL syntax and DocumentDB syntax. Choose my subscription. Choose the resource group. Let's create a new one and let's call this API demo. And location, we put this in UK West. Click create. And this is going to take a while to create, so I'm just going to pause the video here and wait for that to finish. So that's completed and automatically puts us on the getting started page, and we can go into the Explorer and we can see that we have no documents found because we don't have any data. So what we need to do is insert some data. So we're going to insert that GitHub data, and to do that, DocumentDB has a data migration tool. This data migration tool allows us to import from a number of different sources. We've got here JSON files, MongoDB, SQL Server, Azure, even from a different DocumentDB as well. So for our instance, we want to upload JSON files. So we need to add the file. This is the one I've saved. And then we need to export it to the DocumentDB. We need to connect to our DB, and to do that we need to add in the connection string. So if we go on to here, click on the help and scroll down, here is the connection string that we need to use. So we'll put that into there, and we need to put our endpoint in here. So we'll find that in our keys section. So let's copy this here. This is our endpoint. Paste that in there. We now need our account key. We can use this one here. And our database name. which is functions API demo. Click verify, and we can see that we've connected. We want to create a collection called gists, and because it's only 30 records, we don't need to specify a partition key. Collection throughput, that can be the lowest, which is 400, and our ID field is called ID. So that's where we specify that. Everything else can be the same for this, and we can click import. And you can see here that we've transferred the 30 records. So we can close that down now, and we can go into the Query Explorer. And you can see we now have a gist collection, and we can run that query to select star from C. Now C can be anything. It's basically is an alias for collection, so it's basically saying get everything from the gist collection. And you can see here that we have the 30 records that we've just imported. So what we want to do now is expose this via an API, and to do that we'll use the Azure functions. So let's create a new Azure function, and click on the Microsoft Azure Function app. And as you can see here, that this function is actually creating a app service, which is using the Azure Websites.net domain. So the functions actually sit on top of Azure App Services, and which provides a lot of flexibility when developing them, especially locally, and deployment scenarios. So we need to make sure this is unique. So again, let's call this for functions API demo, and we use an existing resource group, API demo. And the hosting plan, we have two. We can either pay as you go, so only when someone hits the endpoint we actually pay, or we can pay monthly. So depending on how popular the API is, for example, if you're getting a lot of hits, then you may want to pay monthly. But if it's rarely used, let's say for like an Alexa skills, or a very simple API that's hardly used, or if you're just doing it for development purposes, then I'd recommend using the consumption plan. And there's a lot that comes out of the box with this as well. So you get quite a lot of free minutes per month, and I'm going to choose UK South for this, and just use an existing storage. Put it on the dashboard. Let's create. That's going to create our app service, or in this case a function app, which is based on an app service. Just give that a few minutes to create. And once that's created, we get entered into the app. Here we can see the function app itself with some settings. You can see here we can also give it a Swagger definition, an OpenAPI 2 definition, which creates some documentation for us as well for our API. So what we need to do is first create a function, and I'm going to create a custom function for this, and I'm going to choose the HTTP trigger, and I'm going to use C# as the language, but you can use F# or JavaScript. I'm going to call this gists, so that automatically will create the endpoint for us, but we can override that later. And I want it to be an anonymous API call. So here we have gists, and by default it will give us some boilerplate code that will do an hello world. so we don't really want to use that. If we click on integrate, we can see that we have the triggers, which is the HTTP request, and that's coming in, and we want to restrict this purely to GET requests. So we can do that by doing that. And the root template will automatically be /gists because of our name, so we don't need to change that. I'm just going to save that. And what we want to do is then bring in a result set from our DocumentDB. So we can do that by selecting an input of DocumentDB. And the input we want is gists. That allows us to utilize this variable, this collection within our code. The collection we want to target is gists. That's the one we've just created on the import. And the database name was functions API demo. And just be careful, this is case sensitive. And we then want to connect to our DocumentDB that we've created. And provide it with a SQL query. So we want to select star from C and save. Now if we go back into the code, we can get rid of all of this boilerplate code which we don't need. We're not using any asynchronous calls, so we can make it synchronous. And instead of returning this, we want to return our gists, and that will be populated here. So we need to bring in an IEnumerable of dynamic, because we don't know what the, because it's schemaless, so we don't know what the type is. And obviously our import, what we called, was gists. So we can save this and we can run this, and we need to make sure we set that to get, and we can see here that our status is okay, and it's obviously not very good in terms of responsive, but you can see there we have our JSON feed. So if we was to bring up Postman, and copy this URL here, paste that in, we can see that we have our API working as expected. You can see the time here is pretty quick as well. Okay, so now if we want to get by ID, so something like this, we will need to create another function to do that. So going back into the function, we can create a new function here, and let's create the same one again, and this will be another HTTP trigger in C#, and we'll call this gists by ID, and we want this to be anonymous. Let's just create that, and again, like before, we can get rid of all of this boilerplate code, get rid of all of this here. Again, we're not using any asynchronous functions here, so let's get rid of that, and we want to return the gists. And even though we're only passing an ID, potentially that could be any where clause, and we should always expect a collection back, even though in this case we're only passing one in. So I'm going to save that, and I'm going to go into the integrate section and restrict this to just get requests. and this time we need to give it a root, and this is basically saying that this will be our endpoint, and we're expecting an ID parameter to be passed in at the end like we would do in any RESTful call. So let's save that, and we want to then link it to our DocumentDB and call this GIST. It will be our GIST collection, and our database name is functions API demo. Our connection's already been set up for us, and we want to select star from C, but this time we want to add a where clause, and we want to go where the ID within our collection is equal to the ID that's passed in via the URL, and this is using special binding syntax to be able to do that. So let's save that, and if we go back into here, we should then have a query that allows us to add an ID here as a parameter. So going back to Postman, if we was to get an ID, so let's get try and find an ID. This one will do, ending in 771, and pass that into there. Give that a test. You can see that's 200 OK. If we go back into Postman and test it there as well, you can see now we only have the one result that's coming back. And that's it. Thanks for listening.